and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'd like to share a video today with you of how I painted this watercolour rhino. It's based on a photograph that my husband took at the Yorkshire Wildlife Park. I've used a limited palette in this painting using just 2 different pigments. I'm starting the video with a little section of tips and techniques, so hopefully that might prove helpful with you on your watercolour journey. The video is a speeded up version of the whole process of painting this guy. Can't get my hand right. And just like every other YouTuber, if you like it, give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more amazing content like this, why not subscribe? Anyway, on with the video. So I've used French Ultramarine and Venetian Red. So using a damp brush, I'm going to mix up the neutral grey. It's approximately a 50-50 mix, but it was a little bit too red, so I'm gradually adding blue until I get the right grey. Now the paint's a milky consistency, so there's quite a lot of pigment in it, but it still flows really nicely. So I'm just swatching it out in my watercolour sketchbook, and now I'm adding clear water, and this shows you how the paint will run nicely and flow, and you get a much lighter grey colour. So adding more water to the mix is sort of like adding white to the colour. And here I'm just showing you the more water you add, the lighter the mix is. Adding more blue gives a cooler grey, which is good for shadow areas in your painting. Dropping in the clear water, which creates blooms, beautiful textured blue, which is ideal for painting lots of animals, not just rhinos. So now I've made a warmer colour, adding more red, so it's a reddy brown colour. And I like to put a little bit of clear water at the side, and the paint that you got down on the paper then flows into the clear water, and you get some really nice effects. Now I'm sprinkling salt onto the paint and seeing which textures I'm going to get. Here's my sword liner. I always forget I've got this. So the bristles are cut at an angle, and you can get really fine lines. So this is the pull movement, so the point of the hair, and the push movement comes from the base, and you work your way out. And with the sword liner you can use it either way, push or pull. When using a liner brush, it's much better to start painting from the base of the hair and pull out away from the body of the animal. So here we've got this beautiful texture from dropping in the water. You can see all the, well, it's a cauliflower effect, but you can see how this is going to be really useful in painting a rhino with its textured skin. It gives you some nice abstract effects. On the browny colour I did drop in salt, but it didn't get much of an effect, but on the single colours the salt worked really well, and I did use that in my main painting. Now we've got the scrubber brush, and you dampen the scrubber brush, wipe off the excess water and scrub the paint away to create highlights, and it's one of my favourite techniques. It works better on some paints than others, working better if it's not a staining paint, but I use this a lot in this painting. Though you can't see it, I've sketched out the outline freehand for this painting. I begin by wetting the whole rhino with my 1-inch square brush. I'm using a more blue coloured grey mix, loosely painting the base layer. As the paper is wet, this will give me a lovely soft effect. It's a good tip to squint at your image so you only see the shadows and lights with no detail. To introduce warmer areas on the rhino, I'm using the Venetian Red. I've sprinkled some salt over the right hand side, which will create a lovely rhino skin texture. The painting has completely dried, and I'm starting on details. I'm using a darker grey mix at a more milky consistency to painting the shadows and details in the ear. I've changed to a size 3 Jackson Studio Synthetic to drop in some Venetian Red. Here I'm using my scrubber to lift some colour, but I'm painting these hairy ears with the Venetian Red using my finest brush, a Rowney liner. I find pushing away from the base gives a point to the hair if you lift your brush slightly towards the end of the stroke. Then onto the horn. I re-wet the horn area and drop in Venetian Red for the warmest tones. I've mixed a warm grey-brown for mid-tones and blue-grey for the shadows, and I just let them move in their own way. I've dropped clear water to create textured blooms, which is one of my favourite effects. I do love textured blooms. Using a quite watery grey mix, I start on the nostrils and wrinkles, trying my hardest not to paint too many details. As you work, you sometimes spot things that need doing in another area, as here you can see me edging the base of the horn. Now, using a thicker mix of the grey, I come in to give depth to the nostrils and wrinkles. I'm using a watery mix for the extended shadows, and I keep the nostril furthest from us lighter and not as detailed. Onto the closest ear, using the dark grey mix to paint in details and shape. As it's closer, I make it darker and more defined. With the smaller horn, I'm using a negative painting technique, which means you paint the shadows around the subject rather than the subject itself. I'm using a watery mix of the grey to map the shadow area, and then coming back in with a darker, richer mix where needed. I'm adding more shadows and texture to the small horn and softening with a damp brush, allowing the colours to blend. The large horn is dry, and you can see how the scrubber brush comes into play, extracting light, highlighted areas. You wet the scrubber and take the excess water off with kitchen roll or a towel, and then scrub out the lighter areas, often rinsing and dabbing off excess water as you work. It works best on dry paint, but I'm always trying to have a go on the wet paint too. Naughty, tisk tisk. Dabbing with kitchen roll helps lift off more of the paint and softens the edges too. And now I remember I've got a sword liner, which is great for painting fine hairs. You can pull down with your stroke using this brush and still achieve a fine point. Now painting the eye, I use a watery mix of the grey. I'd lost all the pencil marks to indicate its position, so I went lightly in case I made a mistake. Now I'm happy with the position of the eye, so I can come in with a darker grey mix to reinforce it. Don't forget, watercolour dries lighter, so some of the wrinkles may need to be darkened later. I'm using the watery grey mix to paint larger shadow areas and taking the opportunity to drop in a few darker colours whilst it's still wet to get a nice blended paint area. Here I'm using darker grey with a liner brush to add detail and depth to some of the wrinkles. And it's always a good idea to step back from your painting every now and then, just to check the values are right and to check you're not overdoing the detail. With the liner brush I'm adding more details, starting painting those wrinkles with a watery grey mix. I'm trying to paint the most obvious and important wrinkles and features, and you've got to try your hardest not to go overboard. With a thicker darker grey I'm adding depth to some lines, and it looks much more effective if you paint the lines as broken lines rather than continuous lines. And now the scrubber brush is in action on highlights. And also for scrubbing unwanted splodges on your painting. Though I want to keep the right hand side loose, I did want to define the head and neck from the body. So here I'm painting shadows in these areas using my Raven size 3 brush. Then the liner comes in for strengthening some lines with broken strokes. Now I'm strengthening some of the neck creases where I feel the shadow should be darker and more defined. And every now and then step back from your painting just to check that you're not doing too much. A few more delicate details with the fine liner, mainly going over existing lines to emphasise them. Then for the final stage, I'm glazing with the Venetian Red to warm up some areas. And then I'm coming in using the blue-grey mix to ramp up some of the shadows. And here's the finished painting, mounted, all ready to frame. I did a splash and some splodges for the background, but I didn't film the process. I splattered the pure Venetian Red, then the French Ultramarine. I do love a good splash and splatter. It helps to create the illusion of movement in a painting. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you very soon. Bye!